They thought it was a joke. A billionaire smirked as he placed $100 million on the table and pointed to a titanium safe that had never been opened by anyone. "Open it," he laughed, "and every dollar is yours." The room exploded with cruel amusement, because standing in front of them was not a hacker, not an engineer, not a genius, but a barefoot man in worn clothes, hands rough from years of manual labor. What no one in that room understood was that this stranger did not come to open a safe. He came to open something far more impossible, the human heart. And before the night was over, the richest men in the room would be on their knees, realizing that money was never their greatest power, nor their greatest prison. Before we continue, take a moment. If stories like this strengthen your faith, tap the like button so more people can discover it. And tell us in the comments, what country are you watching from today? You may not be here by accident. Now, let's go back to the moment everything truly began. The penthouse office sat 42 floors above downtown Chicago, wrapped in glass, steel, and silence. From up there, the city looked small, manageable, owned. Matthew Sandoval stood near the windows with a glass of imported whiskey in his hand, watching traffic crawl beneath him like veins carrying blood through a body he believed he controlled. At 53 years old, Matthew had everything most men spent their lives chasing: a net worth just shy of $1 billion, influence that bent politicians, companies that employed thousands and replaced them just as easily. But tonight, he wasn't thinking about profit margins or acquisitions. He wanted entertainment. Against the far wall stood his latest prize, a Swiss-built titanium safe, military-grade, biometric locks, facial recognition, rotating security codes, the kind of object that existed not because it was needed, but because it sent a message: nothing gets past me. 5 other men stood nearby, executives, investors, billionaires in tailored suits, each one powerful in his own right, each one comfortable in rooms like this. They laughed easily, loudly, the laughter of men who had never been told no. And standing in the center of the room, like someone who had wandered in from another world, was a stranger, barefoot, simple beige work clothes, sandals worn thin, hands calloused from years of honest labor. He stood quietly, eyes calm, posture relaxed, as if he were not surrounded by men who could ruin his life with a phone call. Matthew turned toward him and snapped his fingers. A black briefcase was placed on the table and opened. Inside were stacks of cash neatly bound, crisp, undeniable. $100 million, Matthew said, smiling slowly. Every cent is real. The stranger looked at the money, then back at Matthew. Matthew leaned forward, voice dripping with amusement. "Open my safe, and it's all yours." For a split second, the room was silent. Then, laughter erupted. One man nearly spilled his drink. Another wiped tears from his eyes. Someone slapped the table. "This is incredible," Rodney Pierce said between laughs. "Matthew, you always know how to put on a show." Gabe Ortiz shook his head, grinning. "He probably doesn't even understand how much that is." Leonard Marks added, cruelly, "Or maybe he thinks he can perform miracles." The stranger didn't react. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He simply looked at Matthew and spoke. "Sir," he said calmly, "why offer something you never intend to give?" The laughter stumbled. Matthew blinked. "What did you say?" The stranger's voice remained steady. "If the safe is impossible to open, then you're risking nothing. This isn't an offer." He glanced around the room. "It's a spectacle, a way to humiliate someone you believe is beneath you." The air shifted. Rodney laughed again, but it sounded forced. "Looks like the beggar has opinions." Matthew forced a chuckle, but something about the stranger's eyes unsettled him. "Let's not get philosophical," Matthew said sharply. "I didn't bring you here to talk." He pointed at the safe. "I brought you here to try." The stranger nodded once. "I will." Matthew raised an eyebrow. "You will?" "Yes," the stranger replied. "But first, allow me to ask you one thing." Matthew hesitated, then waved his hand impatiently. "Go on." "What do you keep in that safe?" the stranger asked. "That you believe, is truly valuable. Matthew scoffed. Documents, jewelry, emergency cash? The stranger nodded slowly. Things that can all be replaced. Matthew's smile tightened. And what's wrong with that? The stranger met his gaze. Nothing, he said softly. If you believe those things are all you are. The room fell quiet again. Matthew felt irritation rising, but beneath it, something else. Discomfort. Because for the first time that night, the game was no longer entirely under his control. And he didn't yet realize it. But the real challenge had already begun. Matthew Sandoval did not become powerful by accident. Power had been his obsession long before money ever was. He grew up watching his family lose everything, first their home, then their dignity, then each other, and somewhere in that collapse, Matthew made a silent vow that would shape every decision he made as a man. Never be powerless again. The penthouse office was proof that he had kept that promise. Italian marble floors. Walls lined with abstract art no one understood but everyone admired. Furniture imported from Europe, costing more than most homes in the city. And everywhere, glass. Glass that reminded everyone inside that they were above the world below. Matthew liked standing by the windows during meetings. It gave him a sense of perspective, or perhaps superiority. From up here, people were just shapes moving through traffic, lives reduced to patterns and probabilities. Employees, consumers, variables. The Swiss titanium safe stood against the wall like a shrine. Its smooth surface reflected the room back at itself. 6 powerful men, expensive suits, controlled expressions. Matthew had purchased it after reading about a high-profile theft in another corporation. Not because he feared being robbed, but because the idea of something being beyond his control disturbed him. The safe represented certainty, control, finality. Rodney Pierce leaned against the conference table, swirling his whiskey. That thing alone cost, what, $5 million? Matthew smirked. Worth every dollar. Gabe Ortiz laughed. No one's getting into that. Not in 1,000 years. Leonard Marks nodded. Technology like that doesn't fail. Matthew enjoyed these moments. Men like this rarely admitted fear, but he could hear it hiding beneath their confidence. The safe reassured them. It whispered that their wealth was untouchable, that they were untouchable. Then there was the stranger. Matthew glanced toward him again. The man stood quietly, hands at his sides, eyes wandering the room, not with envy, but with something closer to recognition, as if he had seen places like this before. Matthew didn't like that. He took a sip of whiskey, eyes narrowing slightly. Tell me, Matthew said, breaking the silence, do you even know what $100 million represents? The stranger turned to him. It represents power, Matthew continued. Freedom, safety, control over your future. The stranger listened patiently. And yet, he said, you still sleep behind locked doors. A flicker of irritation crossed Matthew's face. Because I can, he snapped. Because I earned it. The stranger tilted his head. Did you earn peace? The question landed harder than Matthew expected. Rodney chuckled nervously. This guy really likes to talk. Matthew forced a smile, but his grip on the glass tightened. You know, Matthew said coldly, I built everything in this room from nothing. The stranger met his eyes. You built walls, he said gently. Very strong ones. Matthew scoffed. Walls keep danger out. They also keep people out, the stranger replied. The room grew tense. Matthew felt something he hated, uncertainty. He stepped closer to the safe, placing a hand on its cold surface. This, he said, is what real security looks like. The stranger approached slowly, stopping a few feet away. No, he said softly. This is what fear looks like, polished and expensive. The words cut deeper than any insult. Matthew straightened. Enough, he said sharply. You came here for a challenge, not a lecture. He pointed again at the titanium door. Open it. The stranger nodded, calm as ever. I will, he said. But there was something in his voice now, something steady and unshakable. Something that made Matthew feel, for the first time in decades, that he might not be the most powerful man in the room. The room had gone quiet. Not the polite silence of a board meeting, but the kind that presses against the chest, making every breath feel too loud. Matthew stood near the safe, his hand still resting on the cold titanium, as if touching it could restore the confidence that had begun to slip through his fingers. The stranger hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened anyone, and yet something about his words lingered in the air, refusing to disappear. Matthew cleared his throat. "You're very comfortable asking questions," he said, attempting a smirk. "People usually don't talk like that in rooms like this." The stranger met his gaze. "Rooms like this are where questions are most needed," Rodney scoffed. "You're standing in front of men who built empires. You think a few clever words change that?" The stranger turned to him. "I think empires built without mercy eventually collapse under their own weight." Rodney laughed again, but it came out thin. Matthew raised a hand, signaling control. "Let's stay focused," he said. "You wanted to try the challenge. Try it." The stranger nodded, then did something unexpected. He didn't move toward the safe. Instead, he asked another question. "Why is it so important to you," he said calmly, "that this safe remains closed?" Matthew stiffened. "It represents security," he replied. "Protection." The stranger's eyes softened. "Protection from what?" Matthew hesitated, just long enough for the pause to be noticed. "From theft," he snapped. "From chaos. From loss," the stranger added quietly. The word echoed. Leonard shifted uncomfortably. Gabe glanced at the floor. Franklin swallowed hard. Matthew straightened his shoulders. "Everything in this world can be taken," he said firmly. "Only a fool pretends otherwise." The stranger nodded. "And yet," he said, "you've built your entire life trying to outrun that truth." Matthew felt irritation flare. "You don't know anything about my life." The stranger looked at him steadily. "I know you measure your worth by what you control." Silence. "I know you trust systems more than people." More silence. "And I know," the stranger continued gently, "that despite everything you own, you are still afraid of being powerless." The words landed without accusation. That made them worse. Matthew felt his jaw tighten. "This conversation is over," he said sharply. "You're here to open the safe." The stranger finally stepped closer. "I will," he said. "But understand this." He gestured toward the room. "This safe is not the strongest thing here." Matthew frowned. "Oh?" The stranger's gaze swept across the executives, the glass walls, the city beyond. "The strongest thing here," he said, "is the lie you all believe that money has made you untouchable." Rodney bristled. "We are untouchable." The stranger turned back to him. "Then why does every one of you avoid being alone with your thoughts?" That question hit like a sudden drop in temperature. No one answered. Matthew felt his pulse in his ears. "You're stalling," he said. "Are you afraid?" The stranger shook his head. "No." He paused. "I'm giving you one last chance." Matthew scoffed. "A chance for what?" The stranger looked at him, eyes steady and strangely kind. "A chance to realize," he said, "that the door you're trying hardest to keep closed isn't made of titanium. It's the one inside you." And with that, the room crossed a threshold it would never return from. Matthew felt the room slipping away from him. Not physically, but symbolically. For decades, every space he entered bent to his will. Conversations followed his rhythm. People waited for his approval. Silence meant respect. But now, silence felt different. It felt exposed. He straightened his jacket and forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to himself. "You talk like someone who's never had responsibility," Matthew said. "Money isn't just comfort, it's obligation. It keeps people safe." The stranger studied him for a moment. "Does it?" he asked gently. Matthew bristled. "Of course it does. Money feeds families, it builds hospitals, it creates opportunity." The stranger nodded. "And yet," he said, "you've never been more restless than you are now." Matthew opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Leonard cleared his throat, stepping in. "Look, we all know money isn't perfect, but let's not pretend it's evil." The stranger turned to him. "I never said money was evil," he replied calmly. "I asked whether you were—" That stopped Leonard cold. Franklin laughed nervously. That's not fair. The stranger met his eyes. Then answer me, he said. When was the last time you slept through the night without needing alcohol, pills, or distraction? The room stiffened. Matthew felt a pulse of anger rise, then fade into something heavier. You don't get to psychoanalyze us, he snapped. You have no idea what pressure looks like at this level. The stranger's voice softened. I do. Matthew frowned. Oh, really? Yes, the stranger said quietly. Because pressure doesn't come from responsibility. He paused. It comes from living in a way your conscience cannot defend. No one laughed this time. The stranger took a slow step toward the center of the room. You protect your wealth, he continued, because you believe it gives you control. But control isn't peace. He looked at Matthew. Peace is being able to close your eyes at night and not relive the faces of people you stepped over to get where you are. Matthew felt something tighten in his chest. Rodney shifted, avoiding eye contact. Gabe's jaw clenched. You think we're monsters, Rodney muttered. The stranger shook his head. No, he said. I think you're tired. That word cut deeper than accusation. Tired of pretending your lives are full when they're only crowded? Tired of guarding things that can disappear overnight? Tired of waking up successful and going to bed empty? Matthew felt the room tilt slightly. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours straight in years. The stranger's eyes rested on the open briefcase of cash. You call this valuable, he said. But value isn't measured by what others envy. He looked back at Matthew. True value is measured by what remains when no one is watching. Matthew swallowed hard. And what would you know about value? He asked, quieter now. The stranger answered without hesitation. I know the value of a clear heart, he said. Of forgiveness. Of humility. Of love that costs something. He paused. And I know how much it hurts to live without those things. The room stood still. Matthew looked at the safe, at the money, at the men around him. And for the first time that night, a thought crossed his mind that frightened him more than loss ever had. What if everything he had worked for wasn't enough? And what if, deep down, he had always known it? Matthew turned back toward the titanium safe, as if its presence could steady him. He placed his palm flat against the metal, cold, smooth, flawless. This, he said firmly, is what security looks like. The stranger followed his movement with his eyes, but did not approach. Not yet. Security, the stranger repeated softly. Matthew straightened. Yes, this safe protects what matters. It's backed by military technology. Fingerprint scans, facial recognition, rotating encryption codes. He allowed himself a thin smile. It doesn't fail. Leonard nodded in agreement. Multiple redundancies, backup power systems, independent servers. It's impossible to breach. Gabe added, nothing that expensive ever breaks. The stranger finally stepped closer, stopping just short of touching it. Tell me, he asked calmly, how long did it take you to memorize the code? Matthew scoffed. I don't need a code. Biometric access is safer than memory. The stranger tilted his head. So your security depends entirely on technology. Yes, Matthew replied sharply, because technology is reliable. The stranger paused. Until it isn't. Rodney laughed dismissively. That's paranoia. The stranger looked at him. No, he said, it's history. He gestured toward the city beyond the glass. Empires fall, systems collapse, markets crash, power grids fail. He turned back to them, and every time it happens, people who trusted metal and numbers discover how fragile their confidence really was. Matthew felt irritation spike again. You're talking in abstractions, he said. In the real world, you protect what you own. The stranger repeated one word slowly. Own. He looked at Matthew directly. When you die, he asked quietly, which part of this do you take with you? The question landed heavily. No one answered. Franklin shifted his weight, staring at the floor. Leonard's jaw tightened. Gabe folded his arms defensively. Matthew forced himself to speak. Ownership creates order, he said. It's how civilization functions. The stranger nodded. Yes, he said. And when ownership becomes identity, civilization rots from the inside. Matthew frowned. That's philosophy. The stranger's voice softened, but only slightly. No, he said. That's consequence. He gestured again toward the safe. This box represents your belief that you can seal yourselves away from loss, from pain, from accountability. He took one more step closer. But nothing built by human hands is eternal. The room felt smaller now. Matthew glanced at the executives around him, men who had built their lives on certainty, on numbers that always went up, on contracts enforced by power. "What do you want?" Matthew asked, his voice lower than before. The stranger met his eyes. "I want you to understand," he said, "that the strongest walls you've built aren't made of titanium." He tapped his chest lightly. "They're here." Matthew's breath caught. "You think this safe protects you," the stranger continued, "but it only hides what you're afraid to face." Matthew clenched his fist. "And what would that be?" he demanded. The stranger's answer came without hesitation. "Your own emptiness." Silence spread like a heavy fog. Matthew felt something crack, not loudly, not visibly, but enough to unsettle everything that had felt solid moments before. For the first time, the safe no longer looked invincible. It looked like a confession. And deep down, Matthew sensed that whatever was coming next would shatter more than steel. The stranger stood perfectly still. No anger, no triumph, no hesitation, only certainty. Matthew felt it before it happened, the shift in the room, like air pressure changing before a storm, the kind that makes animals uneasy, the kind that makes instincts scream. "Enough," Matthew said sharply. "You've said your piece." The stranger didn't move. Instead, he spoke Matthew's name. Matthew Sandoval. Something about the way he said it, slow, deliberate, sent a chill through the room. "You were born on March 15th, 1970. Matthew froze. The glass in his hand trembled. "That's not public information," Matthew said quickly. "Who told you that?" The stranger continued, calm as stone. "Your mother died when you were 12. The words hit harder than any accusation. "Cancer," the stranger added. "Aggressive. Painful." Matthew's face drained of color. "You never forgave her," the stranger said gently, "for leaving you, even though it wasn't her choice." The room fell completely silent. No laughter, no whispers, only breathing ragged and uneven. "How do you know that?" Matthew whispered. The stranger stepped closer, not threatening, not invading, but unavoidable. "Your first major business decision," he continued, "was not made for profit." Matthew shook his head slowly. "Stop. You bought the building your family was evicted from," the stranger said, voice steady. "Not because it was a good investment, but because you wanted revenge." Matthew's knees weakened. Rodney stared at him, wide-eyed. "Matthew?" The stranger turned his gaze toward Rodney next. "Rodney Pierce," he said. Rodney straightened instinctively. "What about me?" "You built your real estate empire after the housing crash," the stranger said. "Buying properties for pennies. Evicting over 400 families." Rodney scoffed weakly. "That was legal." "Yes," the stranger replied. "And 2 of those families became homeless." Rodney's mouth opened, then closed. "There was a mother," the stranger continued, "with 3 children. One of them got pneumonia, sleeping through winter nights with no shelter." Rodney's face contorted. "That's not my responsibility." "I saw her cry," the stranger said quietly. "I saw the children shiver." Rodney stumbled backward, grabbing the table. Leonard swallowed hard. The stranger turned toward him next. "And you, Leonard Marks." Leonard stiffened. "Don't. 14 workers have died in your oil facilities." Leonard shook his head violently. "Those were accidents." The stranger's voice sharpened, not loudly, but with authority. "Accidents made inevitable when you cut safety budgets by 40% to increase margins." Leonard's face crumpled. 14 widows, the stranger said. 14 families asking why their fathers never came home. Leonard dropped to one knee, gasping as if punched. The stranger's gaze shifted again. "Gabe Ortiz." Gabe flinched. "I've done nothing illegal." "You inherited a fortune," the stranger said, and multiplied it. He paused. But you never asked who paid the cost. Gabe's jaw tightened. I follow regulations. You exploit silence, the stranger replied. Underpaid workers. Harassment ignored. Complaints buried. Gabe's hands shook. And you, the stranger said, turning to Franklin Shaw. Franklin tried to laugh. This is absurd. You've calculated the value of everything, the stranger said, except a human life. Franklin collapsed into his chair, covering his face. The room looked nothing like a penthouse now. It looked like a courtroom. Matthew finally spoke, voice breaking. Who are you? The stranger looked at all of them. I am not here to expose you, he said softly. You've done that yourselves. Matthew's chest felt tight. Then why are you doing this? The stranger's eyes held no hatred. Because truth is the only thing strong enough to break chains, he said. And every one of you has been bound for years. Matthew felt fear not fear of ruin, but fear of recognition, because nothing the stranger had said was wrong. And because deep down, Matthew understood something terrifying. No human being should have known these things. Yet somehow, this man did. And whatever happened next would not be controlled by money. The silence that followed was unbearable. No one laughed now. No one moved. Even the city outside the glass walls seemed to hold its breath. Matthew felt his heart pounding against his ribs. Not with anger, but with something far more unsettling. Exposure. He had spent his life controlling narratives, shaping outcomes, buying silence when necessary. Yet everything the stranger had spoken, every detail, had cut through him with surgical precision. This wasn't luck. This wasn't research. Matthew swallowed hard. Who are you? He asked again, his voice barely steady. The stranger looked at him, not like a victor, not like an accuser, but like someone seeing an old wound reopen. I am a carpenter, he replied simply. The answer made no sense. Rodney let out a shaky breath. That's not funny. I work with my hands, the stranger continued calmly. I always have. Leonard wiped his face, eyes red. You expect us to believe you're just a worker? The stranger nodded. Yes. Gabe laughed weakly, almost hysterically. You know things no one could know. You speak like a judge. And you say you're a carpenter? The stranger's gaze swept the room. I build, he said. But not what you build. Matthew frowned. Then what do you build? The stranger paused, choosing his words with care. I build what you've spent your lives tearing down. He stepped toward the center of the room. I walk among people you no longer see. I listen to voices you've trained yourselves to ignore. I hear prayers whispered by janitors, by guards, by workers who clean your offices long after you've gone home. The room felt colder. I am present, the stranger continued. When a mother cries because she doesn't know how she'll feed her children. When a worker goes home injured and afraid to complain. When someone you dismissed as insignificant asks God if anyone still sees them. Matthew's throat tightened. You've mistaken my silence for absence, the stranger said. But I have always been watching. Franklin whispered. Why us? The stranger turned to him. Because you still have time. That answer landed harder than any condemnation. Matthew felt tears burn behind his eyes. Time for what? The stranger looked at each man slowly. Time to choose who you will become, he said. Time to decide whether power will continue to harden you or finally break you open. Matthew's hands trembled. You could destroy us, Matthew said. Expose everything. The stranger nodded. Yes. Then why don't you? The stranger's voice softened. Because I didn't come to destroy you. He took a step closer to Matthew. I came to wake you. The words echoed in the room. Matthew realized then that the fear gripping him was not fear of punishment. It was fear of change. Fear of losing the armor he had worn for decades. Fear of what would be left underneath. The stranger turned toward the titanium safe. Now, he said quietly, we can return to your challenge. Matthew's eyes followed him. And for the first time since the night began, Matthew wasn't wondering whether the safe could be opened. He was wondering whether he could. The stranger stepped toward the safe. Every sound in the room seemed to grow louder, the faint hum of electricity, the distant horns from the street below, the shallow breathing of men who had suddenly forgotten how to be powerful. Matthew watched closely. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the illusion would collapse, when the barefoot man would fail. "Go ahead," Matthew said, his voice tight. "Try." The stranger stood before the titanium door, studying it not like a puzzle to be solved, but like a truth already understood. He did not reach for tools. He did not ask for instructions. He did not request access. Instead, he closed his eyes. The room shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but something changed like pressure before a storm, or the stillness just before a wave breaks. Rodney swallowed. "What is he doing?" Leonard whispered. "This is ridiculous." The stranger opened his eyes and spoke not loudly, but with a calm authority that seemed to carry weight. "I don't need codes," he said. "I don't need scanners. I don't need technology." Matthew scoffed nervously. "Then you're wasting our time." The stranger placed his palm flat against the cold metal. "For nothing in this world," he continued, "is truly closed to the one who comes with a clean heart." For a brief moment, nothing happened. Matthew felt a flicker of relief. Then the screen on the safe flickered. Once. Twice. A low mechanical hum filled the room. "What the hell?" Gabe muttered. The biometric panel glitched. Numbers scrambled across the display, cycling too fast to follow. The system emitted a sound none of them had ever heard before. Neither alarm nor confirmation, but something in between. Matthew stepped forward instinctively. "That's not possible." The stranger didn't move. The hum deepened. Then click. Soft. Final. The sound echoed louder than any explosion. The safe door unlocked. Slowly, almost reverently, it swung open. Time seemed to freeze. Matthew staggered back, as if struck. Rodney's knees buckled. Gabe collapsed into his chair. Leonard stared, mouth open, hands shaking. Franklin stood frozen, unable to speak. "No," Matthew whispered. That can't be." The stranger stepped aside, allowing them to see. Inside the safe were stacks of cash, velvet boxes of jewelry, deeds, contracts, everything Matthew had protected with obsession. The proof of his power, or so he had believed. "How?" Matthew breathed. "There's no physical way." The stranger turned to him. "You said it was impossible," he replied calmly. Matthew's voice cracked. "It is." The stranger's eyes held no triumph. "Nothing is impossible," he said, "for faith the size of a mustard seed." The room felt heavy, not with awe, with fear, because what had just happened wasn't merely a breach of security. It was a collapse of certainty. Matthew stared into the open safe and felt something shift deep inside him. If this could be opened, if this could fail, then perhaps the walls he had trusted all his life were never real to begin with. And perhaps the greatest impossibility of all was not opening a safe of titanium, but opening a heart hardened by years of pride. No one spoke. The safe stood open, its titanium door hanging wide like a mouth that had finally confessed. Matthew stared into it, breathing shallowly, as if the air itself had grown heavier. Everything he had spent years protecting was there perfectly arranged, untouched, and suddenly unimpressive. The stranger reached inside, not hurried, not impressed. He lifted a thick bundle of cash and held it up between his fingers. "Look," he said quietly. Matthew flinched. "This," the stranger continued, "is what you worship." He turned the bundle slowly, examining it as though it were a foreign object. "Paper," he said. "Printed numbers. Promises enforced by fear." Matthew's mouth opened. "That money." The stranger let the bills fall. They hit the marble floor with a dull, lifeless sound. "And for this paper," the stranger said, his voice steady but piercing, "you sold your soul." The words struck harder than any accusation that had come before. "For this paper," he continued, "you broke families." He looked at Rodney. "For this paper, you put children on the street." Rodney covered his face, shoulders shaking. "For this paper," the stranger said, turning to Leonard. You accepted that some lives were worth less than profit. Leonard let out a broken sound, dropping his head. For this paper, the stranger said to Gabe, you learned to look away. Gabe's hands trembled uncontrollably. For this paper, he said finally, facing Matthew again, you forgot what it meant to be human. Matthew felt tears spill freely now. He had cried before privately, in anger, in frustration, but never like this. Never in front of witnesses, never stripped of all defenses. You think this makes you powerful, the stranger said, gesturing toward the open vault. But power that costs your humanity is not power. He stepped closer to Matthew. It is a prison. Matthew fell to his knees. Not deliberately, not dramatically. His body simply gave in. I thought, Matthew whispered, voice breaking, that if I had enough, I wouldn't feel empty. The stranger knelt beside him. Emptiness does not come from lacking things, he said gently. It comes from lacking love. Matthew's shoulders shook. I tried to outrun it, he sobbed. I tried to buy it away. The stranger placed a hand lightly on Matthew's shoulder. And it only grew heavier, he said. Matthew nodded, unable to speak. The stranger rose and turned back to the room. This is what money can never give you, he said. Peace, forgiveness, rest. He glanced once more into the safe. All of this will remain here when you are gone, he said softly. But what you have done will follow you. The words hung in the air like a final verdict. Matthew looked up, eyes red and raw. If this isn't salvation, he asked quietly, then what is? The stranger met his gaze. And for the first time that night, his answer was not a challenge. It was an invitation. The room felt different now. Not quiet with fear, but heavy with truth. Matthew remained on his knees, tears streaking down his face, his expensive suit wrinkled against the marble floor. The open safe behind him no longer looked like a trophy. It looked like an accusation. He lifted his head slowly. If this isn't salvation, he asked again, voice raw, then what is? The stranger looked at him with eyes that carried no judgment, only clarity. Salvation, he said softly, is not found in what you possess. He took a step forward. It is found in what you are willing to let go of. Matthew's breath caught. The stranger turned toward the others. You have spent your lives accumulating, he continued, building higher walls, securing yourselves against every possible loss. He paused. And yet, none of you are secure. Rodney wiped his face, voice shaking. Then what are we supposed to do? The stranger's gaze rested on him. First, he said, you must see. Leonard frowned. See what? See that your value has never come from your wealth, the stranger replied, and that the value of others has never been less because they have none. The room stood still. The stranger walked slowly toward the window, looking out at the city below. There are millions down there, he said, who believe they are invisible. He turned back. They clean your buildings, guard your doors, build your roads, stock your shelves. He let the words settle, and they pray. Matthew's head snapped up. They pray, the stranger repeated, that someone will see them. Franklin whispered, why would they pray for us? The stranger's answer was quiet and devastating. Because love does not wait for worthiness. He stepped back toward Matthew. 2,000 years ago, the stranger said, I told you it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Matthew inhaled sharply. I wasn't condemning wealth, the stranger continued. I was exposing its danger. The men listened, transfixed. Wealth convinces you that you are self-sufficient, he said, that you are the source of your success, that you are above need. He looked directly at Matthew, and the moment you believe that, you stop reaching for God. Matthew's lips trembled. That's why the door feels so narrow, the stranger said. Not because heaven is cruel, but because pride makes you too wide to enter. Tears streamed freely now, not only from Matthew, but from the others as well. Gabe whispered, Who are you? The stranger smiled. This time, there was no sadness in it, only light. I am the son of a carpenter, he said. I am the friend of sinners and outcasts. I am the one who walks with the poor. The room felt like it was breathing with him. I am the one who healed the sick, lifted the forgotten, and ate with those society despised. Matthew's heart pounded. I am the one who died for you, the stranger said, voice steady. Even knowing many would reject me, he looked at each man in turn. And I am the one who still comes back. Silence fell not empty, but full. Matthew whispered, Jesus. The stranger nodded gently. I stand at the door and knock, he said, not to force my way in, but to be invited. Matthew bowed his head completely. The men around him felt it too, something unmistakable, undeniable. This was not a lecture, not a metaphor. This was an encounter. Jesus turned toward the door. You will not be able to explain what happened here, he said. If you try, they will laugh. He glanced back over his shoulder. So don't explain it. Live it. And with those words, the night crossed from revelation into decision. No one moved. Jesus stood near the door, his presence calm, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. As if this moment had been waiting for them far longer than they had been waiting for it. Matthew was the first to break. He didn't stand. He didn't wipe his face. He simply bowed lower, pressing his forehead to the cold marble floor. I don't know how to change, he said, his voice barely audible. I've built my entire life the wrong way. His shoulders shook as the words spilled out. I chased power because I was afraid of being weak. I hoarded money because I was afraid of being empty. I hurt people because I didn't know how to love them. He lifted his head, eyes red, desperate. Please, Matthew whispered. Tell me what to do. The room held its breath. Jesus turned back toward him and walked slowly across the floor. He knelt not above Matthew, but beside him. Begin, he said gently, by giving away what you do not need to those who do. Matthew nodded, tears falling freely. Pay fairly, Jesus continued. Treat every worker as your brother. Stop measuring human worth by profit. Rodney's knees buckled next. He dropped heavily into a chair, then slid down until he too was kneeling. I thought I was just playing the game, Rodney sobbed. I told myself it wasn't personal, that numbers didn't have faces. He covered his face with both hands. I was wrong. Jesus turned to him. Then repair what you can, he said. Restore what was taken, and learn to see people before property. Leonard collapsed forward, his large frame shaking. I told myself accidents were inevitable, he cried, that this was the cost of progress. He looked up, broken. I let men die. Jesus' voice was firm but not cruel. Protect life as if it were your own, he said, because in truth it is. Gabe slid from his chair, sitting on the floor, arms wrapped around himself. I inherited everything, he admitted, and I convinced myself that meant I deserved it. He looked up, ashamed. I learned how to ignore suffering. Jesus met his gaze. Then learn to listen, he said, and use what you were given to lift those who were never heard. Franklin was last. He stood frozen for a long moment, then finally sank to his knees as well. I calculated everything, he whispered. Risk, reward, return. He looked up, eyes hollow. I never calculated compassion. Jesus stepped closer. Then begin there, he said, because mercy is the only investment that never loses its value. The 5 men knelt scattered across the penthouse, men who once controlled markets, laws, lives, now stripped of every illusion. Matthew spoke again, voice trembling. Do you forgive us? Jesus' answer was immediate. You were never unforgiven, he said. They looked up, stunned. Forgiveness was never the barrier, Jesus continued. Pride was. He stood and looked at each of them. I did not come to shame you, he said. I came to invite you. Matthew's chest heaved. Invite us to what? Jesus' gaze softened. To become who you were always meant to be. Silence settled, not heavy, but peaceful. For the first time in years, the men felt something unfamiliar rise within them, hope, and they understood, deep in their bones, that whatever came next would not be easy, but it would finally be real. Jesus rose to his feet, and the room seemed to rise with him. The men remained on their knees, waiting not for punishment, but for direction. Whatever arrogance had once filled the penthouse was gone, replaced by a fragile willingness to obey. Jesus looked at them one by one. "Awakening is only the beginning," he said. "What matters now is what you do when the emotion fades." Matthew swallowed. "Tell us," he said quietly, "what happens next?" Jesus walked toward the window, looking out at the city again, at the lights beginning to flicker on, one by one, like small prayers rising into the dark. "I will give you 1 year," he said. The words landed with weight. 1 year, Jesus continued, "not to feel sorry for yourselves and not to perform charity for applause." He turned back. 1 year to prove that this moment was not fear, but transformation. Rodney frowned slightly. "And how will we prove that?" Jesus' answer was precise. "Begin by selling what you do not need," he said. "Not as a gesture, but as a release." Matthew nodded slowly. "Create wages that allow families to live with dignity," Jesus continued. "Not survival wages, living ones." Leonard's breath caught. "Build safety as if every worker were your own child," Jesus said to him. "And compensate the families of those you failed to protect." Leonard bowed his head. "I will." Jesus turned to Gabe. "Clean your company of every form of exploitation," he said. "Do not hide behind silence or policy." Gabe nodded, tears falling. "I understand." Jesus faced Franklin. "Pay what you owe," he said. "Not what you can legally avoid what you owe." Franklin exhaled shakily. "Yes." Jesus returned his gaze to Matthew. "Create a fund," he said. "Not as condescending charity, but as repair. Acknowledge that your wealth was built by hands you ignored." Matthew nodded fiercely, memorizing every word. "Share profits," Jesus added. "Give workers ownership, not just paychecks." The room felt charged, not with fear, but with responsibility. Jesus paused, then said something unexpected. "You will fail." The men looked up, startled. "You will stumble," Jesus continued calmly. "Old habits will return. Temptations will whisper that nothing has truly changed." Matthew clenched his fists. "But," Jesus said firmly, "when that happens, remember this moment." He looked at each of them. "Remember how it felt to see yourselves clearly." Silence followed. Rodney spoke softly. "And after 1 year," Jesus' gaze was steady, "I will return," he said, "not to judge you, but to see what you have built." Matthew felt his chest tighten. "And if we fail?" Jesus' voice did not harden. "If you return to your old ways," he said, "your wealth will become your burden." He paused. "Not because I punish you, but because you will have chosen emptiness again." Jesus stepped toward the door. "But if you choose justice," he said over his shoulder, "if you choose dignity over gain," he turned back one last time, "then your wealth will become a blessing." The men bowed their heads as Jesus walked out. The door closed softly behind him, and for the first time in their lives, the richest men in the room felt the full weight of a year that would change everything. The penthouse was silent after Jesus left. No thunder, no flash of light, no dramatic disappearance. Just the soft click of the door closing. The titanium safe remained open. Matthew stood slowly, his legs weak, and walked back toward it. The contents hadn't changed, cash stacked neatly, documents perfectly arranged, but something about them felt hollow now. He reached inside, not with reverence, but with resolve. "This," he said quietly, "is no longer a trophy." The others gathered around him. Rodney nodded. "It looks different." Leonard exhaled. "It feels heavy." Matthew turned to them. "Then let's decide what it becomes." He took a bundle of cash and placed it on the table. "This is the beginning," he said. 100 million goes into a community transformation fund." Rodney didn't hesitate. "I'll match it." Leonard followed. "So will I." Gabe added quietly, "All of us should." Franklin nodded. "Another 100 million, shared." Matthew felt something unfamiliar in his chest, not pride, but purpose. They spent the next hours not discussing acquisitions or margins, but people, families displaced, workers injured, communities ignored, plans formed slowly, imperfectly, honestly. As the night deepened, the men finally left the penthouse, one by one. Matthew stayed behind. He looked at the city again, at the lights, the movement, the lives continuing below. For the first time, he didn't feel above it. He felt responsible to it. The next morning, the boardroom was full. Not just executives, but janitors, security guards, cafeteria staff. Matthew stood at the front, hands trembling. "Yesterday," he began, "I met someone who showed me who I really was." Murmurs rippled through the room. "I can't explain everything," Matthew continued, "but I can show you what changes today." He took a breath. "Profit sharing begins immediately." Gasps. "Minimum wages increase 50%. Silence, then whispers. "Health care will cover families." A woman near the back began to cry. "We are creating a $100 million fund for community repair," Matthew said. "Not for publicity, but for justice." A janitor raised her hand hesitantly. "Sir, is this a joke?" Matthew met her eyes. "What's your name?" "Maria," she replied softly. "Maria," Matthew said, his voice breaking, "I've walked past you for 12 years without seeing you." He stepped closer. "I can't change that, but I can change tomorrow." He offered her a new position, one that gave her voice, authority, dignity. Applause erupted. Over the following months, change spread outward. Rodney sold luxury properties to build dignified housing. Leonard transformed safety standards across his industry. Gabe restructured his company to protect the vulnerable. Franklin paid what he owed and helped close loopholes he once exploited. Not everything worked perfectly. Mistakes were made. Projects failed. Old habits tempted. But this time, they corrected instead of covering up. 6 months later, Matthew received a handwritten note. No signature, just 3 words. "I am watching." He shared it with the others. "We don't do this for him," Gabe said firmly. "We do this because it's right." Matthew nodded. "But I want him to see," he said. At night, Matthew returned home to something he hadn't known in years: conversation, laughter, rebuilding. The safe in the penthouse was eventually closed again, but it was never locked. Because the true vault, the one that had mattered most, had already been opened, and it would never close again. If this story stirred something deep inside you, that wasn't coincidence. It was a reminder. A reminder that the hardest vault to open is not made of steel or titanium. It is the human heart, hardened by fear, pride, pain, or disappointment. Tonight, you may not be a millionaire. You may not own a penthouse or a company, but you may recognize something of Matthew in yourself. The exhaustion, the restlessness, the quiet sense that no matter how much you achieve, something still feels missing. Jesus did not come to that room to humiliate the rich. He came to rescue the lost. And he did not open the safe to prove his power. He opened hearts to restore purpose. The same Jesus who walked into that room walks beside you right now. He is not asking for perfection. He is not demanding a performance. He is simply knocking, asking if you are willing to open what you've kept closed for so long. So before this video ends, let's do 3 simple things together. First, if this story touched your heart, take a moment to like this video, not for the algorithm, but as a quiet acknowledgement that God met you here. Second, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. This channel is a place where people from all over the world gather not to argue, but to walk together in faith. And if you feel led, write a simple sentence: "I believe." Your words may be the encouragement someone else desperately needs tonight. Third, if you want more stories like this, stories that remind us that heaven still walks among us, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We don't tell these stories to entertain. We tell them to awaken. Because no matter how far you feel from God, no matter how long you've been lost, no matter how heavy your past feels, it is never too late to change direction. The greatest miracle is not wealth restored. It is a heart transformed. And the greatest truth of all is this: you are seen, you are loved, and you are never walking alone. This is Heaven Walks With Us. And until the next story, may peace guard your heart, may purpose guide your steps, and may you always remember, Jesus still walks with us.